Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the poetry of Rasunah Marsden, whom I'm reading out of Native Poetry in Canada. So Marsden is Anishinaabe and French, but that does not come close to reflecting the full scope of the cultural background and experience that she brings to her poetry. Marsden traveled extensively. She lived and worked in multiple cultures and parts of the world, including Australia and Indonesia. She has written a ton of different types of things. One of the things that the critical introduction in this book about her talks about is that she tried to embrace different types of writing, technical writing, poetry, obviously, TV writing, news writing, all of these different styles, because she wanted to explore the full range of strategies, styles, techniques that this art form would allow. And so one of the things that her poems often represent or reflect is this sort of multiculturalism, hybrid identities, these blending of types and styles and worlds in ways that are really, really interesting. So one of her poems that has this sort of hybrid identity approach and also reflects this really super detailed approach that Marsden takes is the poem Three Objects. So it's three stanzas, as one might reasonably expect from a poem called Three Objects, and it goes through these different artifacts. And they're from different cultures, they mean different things, but they all reflect in some way hybridity, a combined identity or combined identity elements. So that's one thing to focus on here. The other thing, again, is this sort of really super detailed descriptions that she gives of these objects. So this is Three Objects. One side was male, wizened long beard, the other female, full-faced, both with mirror or bowl in hand, formed of the same seated body, face in face, curved long lines, robed, jade perfect even atop, carved roughness out of rock. Grotesque this guardian, majestic, teeth curl round, fire-breathing sneer holes with mane Egyptian waves and tail this lion. Sheaf rectangular bone, curved at each end, old ivory and black, striped down center, enameled red words, villages, mountains, on either side, 100 slender teeth. So again, there's this hybridity, right? This bifurcation of these objects. One side was male, the other female. The first and third line of the first stanza. Grotesque and majestic, the first and third line of the second stanza. These seemingly opposite characteristics. Old ivory and black, striped down center, the third, fourth, and fifth lines of the third stanza. The contrast of colors, right? And all of these things are brought together in these objects. The hybridity, the duality, the multiplicity of them is reflected in the specific details that Marsden brings in. And so what's cool and striking and interesting and exciting about that is she herself is of dual heritage, right? Anishinaabe and French, but she also has traveled through a number of cultures. And so, as in Canada, her work in Australia, her life in Australia, would be in a strongly bifurcated society between European settler colonialists and indigenous Aboriginal Australians. Now, obviously, in both Canada and Australia, those are not the only ethnic groups, right? There's large South Asian, East Asian, African populations, etc. But mainstream Canadian culture, mainstream Australian culture is traditionally an Anglo-European one, right? In Canada, it's Anglo-French. In Australia, it's primarily Anglo-British, right? And then you have indigenous peoples who have been set up as the cultural other within these societies. So they have a strong bifurcation. Indonesia is slightly different. Indonesia has its own racial and ethnic tensions, but Indonesia also has a long philosophical tradition of sort of multiculturalism, openness, toleration, philosophical commitments to sort of allowing multiple religions, multiple practices, a strong degree of individual determination to one's beliefs, behaviors, etc. And so you've got, again, this sort of multiplicity within a society. And so the three objects, each of which reflects multiple characteristics, you've got this sort of blending of a bunch of different things, a bunch of different truths, all of which combine to make this one poem. Another instance where we see sort of the value of multiculturalism in Marsden's work is Kinanti, a fragment. So Kinanti means culture, according to the little sort of parenthetical footnote at the bottom of the poem. I'll throw that out right at the beginning. But again, we have this, these sort of elements of multiculturalism balanced with the experience of cultural genocide, which was a defining feature and remains so to this day of Indigenous Canadian experience, right, as well as Indigenous American experience. But Kinanti, a fragment. This is the river with tributaries which led to the ocean, overloaded with the silt of civilization, whose surface is glazed over with reflections of genocide. I flowed through borderless lands in childhood days. The salt in oceans cleansed my blood. No shores were foreign to me. Under the dazzling suns of history, the cool hands of toiling mothers shook out their secrets and hung them out to dry. This is the mountain over whose rugged, refreshing terrain and forests, animals, and beings were swallowed whole by memory, over whose wind-swept heights the intellect of mankind's genius was reduced to broken debris. I rose out of limitless aspiration and scoured heaven for a resting place. Buried deep in my womb were the inspirations of mankind, born out of my ears where snow sweeps sky, and where the spirit of the times spawned the issues of the day. This is the wasteland upon whose aridity the foundations of will and force are laid. Know me as shape-maker, the instrument which fashions glass from dust that I am, for the sword of power thrown to earth by passing meteorites, and wrought into the scepters of kings who wield them that I am. Know me as creator who traced their outlines as wind follows sand, and out of all images are authored their comings and goings, delineated as sharply as our oases forded overland that I am. Kinanti culture. So again, there's this sort of almost mythic sense here of what the poet persona's identity is, of the world that they inhabit, right? There's almost this sort of fantastic element in the sort of Lord of the Rings sense of fantastic, right? That it is a world imbued with power on a world imbued with symbolism, a world imbued with its own existences as such, right? The river overloaded with the silt of civilization. The combining of the poet persona's identity with that of the landscape. I flowed through borderless lands in childhood days. The salt in oceans cleansed my blood. No shores were foreign to me. I mean, this is the river speaking, right? The poet persona and the river become blended here. Their identities merge. And again, there's this sort of multiculturalism to this. Borderless lands, no shores were foreign to me, etc., etc. This sort of sense of cosmopolitanism, right? The interconnectedness of peoples across the board. And this is tinged with this sort of dystopian aspect, right? This sense that this earlier world of freedom and unity and interconnectedness and the fantastical has been lost or destroyed. I mean, the poem has a kind of apocalyptic tone to it. And so I think in this sense, it does reflect a deep and justified anxiety about indigenous cultures within settler colonial contexts like Canada or Australia, but also a loss of cultures, freedoms, etc., in the capitalist world of today, right? This sort of idea that capitalism as one of its sort of major facilities in the contemporary world is destructive of environments and the identities that are inherently built into those, particularly, again, indigenous identities, which are often rooted very much in place and in natural spaces. So, another one of her poems that reflects this sort of interconnection between the human and the natural, or even the divine on some levels, is the poem Yellow Leaves. Yellow Leaves. Yellow leaves announced premature change. Earwigs crowded windowsills or fell off countertops. Fat flies and then the mosquitoes thinned out drastically. Hornets buzzing around the sap of the tree finally burrowed holes underground at the level of the lake, sank, and with it I began yet another year's hibernation. That week my niece called to announce she'd survived the birth, if not so joyously as her newborn son, and my children's calls quieted one by one. Eventually all the curtains were drawn, and with them dreams of the real you who waited for me were dreamt in better worlds where the trees were filled to bursting with yellow leaves. So again, I really like the nature imagery of this poem, particularly this attention to detail of the descent through autumn into the winter and the deaths or going underground of insects as you move from summer into late summer and then into autumn, right? The earwigs, the fat flies, the mosquitoes, the hornets, just that sort of series of details, right, is very, very characteristic of Marsden's approach to poetry, this detail-oriented approach to poetry. But we also have, again, that interconnection, that blending, that obscuring of any distinction between the poet persona and the natural world, right? So, like the last sentence of the first stanza, sank, and with it I began yet another year's hibernation. who's the I of that line, right? Because the previous sentence, or the previous two lines, were about hornets burrowing holes underground at the level of the lake. So is the I spoken on behalf of the hornets, or is the I the poet persona whose niece calls to announce she'd survived the birth of her newborn son at the beginning of the second stanza? Presumably a human poet persona at that point, right? So we've got these sort of blendings of identity and this obscuring of these seemingly distinct and different characters, notions of identity, right? Who is speaking, and their position, their relation to the natural world is obscured at the level of language in ways that create interesting meanings and interesting connections between the human world and the natural world, or that erase those boundaries in ways that are in fact very, very consistent with the ideology and the ethos of many indigenous cultures who don't identify a gap between the human world and the natural world in the way that we in the Western sort of Cartesian tradition tend to.